So you're at work and you walk into the building, you grab your cup of coffee from the company coffee machines, and you go down to start your day. So you're sitting down in your office chair and you're opening up your computer, scrolling through the news. And the first news headline you see is that sitting is the new smoking. And so you're scrolling through this news article and you're reading more and more about this. And you're thinking, oh my gosh, sitting is absolutely terrible for you. But then you stop and think, is that actually true? Well, let's talk about the science behind that.
Welcome to The Science Behind That with Atticus Hamilton.
Hello, all you scientists, and welcome on back to The Science Behind That podcast. I'm your host, Atticus Hamilton, and as you heard from the intro, today we're going to be determining if sitting is really as bad for your health as everyone says it is, and especially if it's as bad for your health as smoking. So sit back, relax, go grab yourself a nice hot cup of coffee, and we'll jump right into today's episode. So there are a lot of alleged health effects of sitting. And I think the goal of today's episode is mainly going to be going through the top two, I think, from the research that I've done, and also comparing it to smoking to find out if the old adage that sitting is the new smoking actually holds water. So starting off, ultimately, there's a lot of different alleged detrimental health effects of sitting for long periods of time, I should add. Your quadriceps and hamstrings and gluteus maximus apparently atrophy, gaining weight, hip and back problems, anxiety, depression, cancer, heart disease, diabetes, varicose veins, deep vein thrombosis, and stiff neck and shoulders. Now, it is worthy to note that when a lot of the research that is done on the negative health effects of sitting are done, they are conducted in a population of people that not only sit for long periods of time, but generally have a very sedentary lifestyle, right? So, for the vast majority of studies out there that you'll see referenced, you're not looking at, young people who exercise 6 times a day, 2-3 hours every day, but that then have a desktop job and sit for 8 hours a day. Usually that's not the demographic. However, I did find a paper that examined that demographic of people, and it was a test group of around 24 participants, and the test subjects were all similar build from an athletic perspective. They all did weight training for 2 hours every day, 6 days a week, and they examined how fat content would change if you have one test group, or between the test group that would be doing all this stuff, but then sitting for a prolonged period of 8+ hours a day at work, and then compared that to the control group that still does all that exercise but doesn't sit for a prolonged period of time. And what they discovered was that in the patients that the test group that was sitting for 8 hours a day, despite the fact that they were very athletic, there was around a 3% higher body fat percentage in that group than the group that didn't sit for 8+ hours a day. Now, unfortunately, that study kind of ended there. They didn't go into depth on any potential circulatory health effects, and I think that could probably be because there's a lot of potential confounding variables there if you were to look at that specific area that they did not go into depth there. But something that is an absolute detrimental effect of prolonged sitting is muscular atrophy depending on how sedentary you are. and circulatory issues. And so we're going to get into that. So starting off, people who are generally very, very sedentary or live a very sedentary life, as you would expect, their muscles would be atrophied to a certain extent compared to people that don't. In particular, when we sit down on our gluteus maximus and our hamstrings and quads for a prolonged period of time, there is some data to show that atrophy rate is accelerated. Now, that could potentially be because you're constantly compressing that muscle and you're not actually walking around to exercise those muscles. That contributes to the atrophy of them, right? Because the main way the gluteus maximus and the hamstrings and the quads, for that matter, i.e. the muscles of the leg, the primary way that they are utilized is for walking, squatting, bending over, running, that sort of thing. And so if you're an individual that is not getting the physical activity you need, it's fair to assume that those muscles are going to atrophy along with the other muscles of the human body. So that's kind of to be expected, I guess. And so that brings me to this thought that I'm not really sure if this article is saying legs and gluteals specifically atrophy from sitting for long periods of time is warranted when it's just the muscles in general that you do not use will atrophy if you do not use them for a very, very, very long period of time. Along with that, we have seen case studies of workers who work 8+ hours a day coming in with back problems. Now, this makes a lot of sense, right? And I'll tell you why. In the back, with the human body, you have two broad groups of muscles. You have extrinsic and you have intrinsic. Now, anatomists will argue with me about which muscles are considered extrinsic and which ones are considered intrinsic, but frankly, I don't really care. The definition I'm using of extrinsic and intrinsic is based on the functional anatomy of the human body and what these muscles actually do. So generally speaking, the intrinsic muscles of the back are going to be your deep muscles. They're going to be the muscles like your splenius capitis on the more superior portion of your spine. But one of the big ones is the erector spinae, and the erector spinae is a massive muscle that starts right at the bottom of the spine, right at the pelvis, the sacrum area, and goes pretty much all the way up to your cervical vertebra. That is a massive muscle. Along with that, you'll have like the iliocostalis lumborium. You'll also have the iliocostalis thoracicus, longissimus thoracicus, spinalis thoracicus. So there's a lot of intrinsic muscles of the back. Specifically, you have the splenius capitis, levator scapulae, splenius cervicus, longissimus thoracicus, spinalis thoracicus, iliocostalis thoracicus, iliocostalis lumborium, and then, of course, the big one, the erector spinae. Now, there are a couple more, and there are certain muscles where it's kind of like the boundary between, is it intrinsic or is it extrinsic becomes kind of vague. Like the rhomboid minors, I don't really consider them intrinsic back muscles necessarily because they are not going to be specifically supporting the spine. So those muscles that I listed are going to be supporting different parts of the spine, and those are your intrinsic back muscles. Now, most people, it's very hard to target those muscles because in retrospect, they're kind of small, right? So the way human anatomy works is, generally speaking, the more muscles you layer on top of one another, the one that's underneath all those layers of muscles is going to have to be smaller than the one on the outside. So generally the extrinsic muscles, and in the case of the back, that would be your trapezius muscle and your longissimus dorsii, those are going to be the big boys, right? The big muscles, because they can't be buried under other muscles because otherwise they'll be constricted. That being said, the intrinsic muscles of the back are extremely important for two big things. Number one is proper posture, and number two is eliminating back pain, or at least reducing back pain. Now, why is that? Reason that is because they're supporting the spine. If you remove those muscles, the spine isn't going to stay upright. Sure, you have the posterior longitudinal thoracic ligament and the anterior longitudinal thoracic ligament, but those aren't going to really hold the spine up. It's primarily the muscles that are doing that, right? And so when it comes to the intrinsics, doing one-arm dumbbell rows or lat pull-downs, they're not going to be really working those muscles. What's going to be exercising those muscles is standing, is making sure, or at the very least, sitting with your back up straight, not hunched over, with proper posture. So walking around, standing with proper posture, that is going to be moving those muscles. And so if we're looking at a patient who sits down for 13 hours a day and doesn't go to the gym, those muscles are going to atrophy. And then what happens when that happens? Or what happens when those muscles atrophy? Well, then you could make the argument that that's why we see a lot of interthoracic disc compression, right? Or the cartilaginous discs between the vertebrae of the spine. They begin to compress, and we see that a lot with extremely sedentary people. And you could argue that that's because their intrinsic back muscles are atrophied because they do not get enough exercise, or they're sitting down for 13 hours a day, which means that there's very little resistance to prevent the weight of the body from crushing the spine, and therefore crushing the vertebra into those interthoracic discs. Intervertebral discs, not interthoracic discs. So that, I think, is the biggest thing. That's next to the health effects of prolonged sitting. That is probably one of the most significant things. Now, how can you avoid that? Well, don't sit for 13 hours a day, and try not to sit for 8 hours a day. And if you can't do that, it may be good advice to make sure that when you are sitting, you're practicing good posture, and that if possible, you break up your time so you're not sitting for longer than a 1 hour straight increment. Now, I know that that's hard for a lot of people to do, especially people in a workplace environment, but it can be done. As for the circulatory effects of prolonged sitting, now there has been research that has been conducted that shows that prolonged sitting between 8 hours a day and 13 hours a day had a significant risk for developing insulin resistance. And so recent research has suggested that when you're sitting down for an extended period of time, your body's metabolism essentially decreases because you're not burning that many calories, and so your body essentially goes into sleeper mode, which therefore impacts your body's production of lipoprotein lipase, which is basically an enzyme that breaks down bad cholesterol. And recent data has shown that it drops by about 90% when you're sitting for extended periods of time of around 11 to 13 hours a day for an extended period of time. And even in patients who sat longer than 90 minutes at a given time, were about twice as likely to develop these issues like insulin resistance and heart disease than their counterparts who limited sitting time to less than 90 minutes at a time. Now, it is important for me to say here that, how does the heart disease component come into this? Well, the heart disease component comes into this because recent medical literature has shown that sitting for very prolonged periods of time reduces the production of lipoprotein lipase, which therefore reduces the reduction of bad cholesterol, which therefore, if not increases the levels of bad cholesterol, it ensures that, the levels of bad cholesterol that are already present maintain at that level. And then that can lead to heart disease through measures that I probably have talked about way too much on this podcast. And so, this was going to be a very short episode today, but in my opinion, and from the research that I've done, those are the two biggest things, is the effect on the articular health of the patient and the effect on the circulatory health of the patient. Now, how does varicosity come into this? Varicose veins. That is a more difficult question, and there's not that much data to look specifically at how sitting affects that. However, the presence of varicose veins is greatly associated with the strength of a person's muscular physiology. Now, why is this the case? Because there is almost a symbiosis between the articular system, the muscles, and the circulatory system in the human body, particularly with the veins. So veins are blood return, right? And unlike arteries, veins do not have a very thick muscular wall. So arteries have a very thick muscular wall, and that is why, if you look at an artery, it's almost a perfect cylinder. Veins are not like that. Veins have a very thin internal muscular layer inside the makeup of the venous wall. And they also have these things called valves, and valves prevent backflow of blood. Now, veins have to have valves because the biggest reason is because their walls are not as strong from a muscular perspective as that of arteries. So they have to have these valves to prevent backflow of blood. But what we've discovered in recent medical research is that the muscles of the body actually help almost massage the veins and keep them at one uniform cylindrical structure to help blood move up, if you're in the legs, or to help blood return to the heart. And my anatomy professor always called this the articular venous system, because the muscles basically massage the veins and ensure that there's even blood flow. However, in patients that have significant muscular atrophy, especially older patients, we see varicose veins in them a lot because of this muscular atrophy. The muscles aren't quite as strong, and so they can't efficiently hold the veins in proper shape. They can't massage those veins to help that blood go back to the heart. So instead you get pooling, generally in spots along the vein where there's valves to prevent backflow, and so the blood kind of pools there. And so if you're sitting for prolonged periods of time, the data suggests that could increase your likelihood for muscular wasting, especially if you don't get any additional exercise, which therefore could increase your risk for developing, or increase the likelihood that you'll develop varicose veins, because it's creating that environment, those environmental conditions. Now, is it as bad as smoking? This is where I have an issue, right? So they say sitting can kill you even if you exercise regularly. And that sitting is the new smoking. And why are they saying this? Well, they're saying this primarily because of the heart disease effects. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I am personally advocating to limit the amount of time as much as possible that we sit down. But I do not agree that it is as bad for you as smoking. I mean, let's do a quick discussion here on smoking. The health effects of smoking. Smoking can directly cause cancer, heart disease, stroke, lung disease, diabetes, and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And that includes emphysema and chronic bronchitis. So the difference between sitting down and the health effects of that and smoking and the health effects of that are that the health effects that result from smoking are directly resulting from smoking. The health effects of sitting down are not really directly resulting from sitting down. It usually, sitting for long periods of time, exacerbates underlying conditions. It's indirectly related. Now, of course, there are exceptions, right? If you're sitting for 13 hours a day, you're probably not getting 2 hours of exercise a day either. But saying that, Phil sits down for 8 hours a day, but works out for 2 hours every day, 6 days a week, saying that regardless of that, because he's sitting down for 8 hours a day, that's as bad as if Phil started smoking a pack of cigarettes a day, that is completely preposterous, right? And, how does smoking cause all these issues? That could be a topic for another episode. But in a nutshell, it's because of the action of nicotine, for one. Nicotine has really nasty effects on cardiomyocytes, heart cells, right? It has nasty effects on heart cells. And then you also have these other things in cigarettes like formaldehyde, arsenic. There's a lot of other compounds in there that are related to the preservation of the tobacco that are not good for you, along with the fact that you're inhaling smoke into your lungs, and there's tar in that smoke from the burning of the tobacco, which can collect in your lungs and cause COPD, emphysema, chronic bronchitis, etc. So I guess to summarize, ladies and gentlemen, the moral of the story is the two biggest negative health effects related to sitting for prolonged periods of time are musculoskeletal or articular health effects like back pain due to atrophying of intrinsic muscles, along with other important muscles of the body like the gluteus maximus, hamstrings, quadriceps, etc. And negative circulatory health or increasing the risk for heart disease due to the downregulation of lipoprotein lipase up to 90%, resulting in an inhibition of the reduction of bad cholesterol, which therefore accelerates atherosclerosis. And then, you compare that to smoking, which causes directly cancer, heart disease, stroke, lung disease, diabetes, and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Both are bad. But I think smoking is probably a little bit worse than sitting for 8 hours a day. So if you are somebody who does have a desk job, the biggest advice is the advice that you would give everybody. Exercise frequently. I personally would say, if you can, try and go for an hour of exercise a day, if possible. Although rest days are important, so maybe an hour of exercise every 5 days or an hour every 6 days. And then try and limit your sitting sessions. So let's say, if you have to sit for 6 hours a day, don't sit for a solid block of 6 hours. If you can, break that up into 6 1-hour increments with potentially a 30-minute break in between or a 10-minute break in between, or get up and walk around, or just stand the entire day. But that might not be so good either. So ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed today's episode of The Science Behind That. I had fun making this one. If I sound tired in this episode, it's because I'm really tired. It's been a long week. I hope you guys have a great Friday. I hope you have a fantastic weekend, and I will see you on Monday. And the episode on Monday is going to be awesome, so definitely stay tuned. Definitely stay tuned for that. That one is going to be really great. It's going to be a long one. But until then, ladies and gentlemen, remember, stand up and question everything.